Charlie Kirk's story begins in the suburbs of Illinois, where the landscape of manicured lawns, church steeples, and small businesses shaped the rhythms of his early life. Born on October 14, 1993, in Arlington Heights, he was the youngest child of Robert and Kimberly Kirk, a middle-class couple whose ambitions for their son reflected the broader optimism of American suburbia. His father was an architect, disciplined and detail-oriented, who believed in designing things that lasted. His mother had once worked in finance before turning toward counseling, a shift that taught her to listen, interpret, and guide. Their household was orderly, Christian, conservative, and aspirational. Charlie was raised in the Presbyterian tradition, attending Sunday services, participating in youth groups, and absorbing the language of faith that would later fuel his public identity. He was bright, restless, and argumentative, often described by his teachers as someone who always wanted to prove a point. While many of his peers played sports or quietly conformed to the culture around them, Kirk gravitated toward debate, polemics, and confrontation. He had the instinct not only to challenge, but to do so in a way that drew attention. One of his earliest brushes with activism came in high school, when administrators raised the price of cookies in the cafeteria. It might have seemed trivial to others, but to Charlie it symbolized something deeper. He organized a protest against what he saw as unfair overreach, testing his ability to mobilize peers and frame grievances as issues of principle. To him, it wasn't about sugar, it was about economics, about freedom, about government power. That small episode revealed the seeds of the personality that would later dominate campus stages and online platforms. By the time the financial crisis hit in 2008, Kirk was already turning toward politics. The collapse of markets, the foreclosures, and the election of Barack Obama shook his sense of the country's direction. He read Milton Friedman and admired Ronald Reagan. He memorized talking points about the dangers of socialism, taxation, and government spending. At just 17, he published an op-ed in Breitbart criticizing liberal bias in history textbooks. That single article opened doors. Producers at Fox News invited him to comment on education and youth culture, and within months he found himself in front of cameras, rehearsing the persona that would make him famous. Sharp, sarcastic, combative, and utterly certain of his own arguments. Yet his path was not destined to be smooth. Kirk had dreamed of attending West Point, but when his application was rejected, the rejection cut deeply. He spoke openly about the disappointment, framing it later as the moment he realized he was destined not for military service, but for ideological battle. It was also around this time that he met Bill Montgomery, a Tea Party activist 3 decades older than him. Over coffee, the two spoke about the absence of conservative voices on college campuses. Montgomery encouraged Kirk to think bigger. In 2012, together they founded Turning Point USA, a nonprofit with the mission of spreading conservative values in universities across the nation. The timing was perfect. Conservative donors, alarmed by what they saw as the radicalization of academia, were hungry for a new generation of activists to counter the left. Kirk positioned himself as that messenger. The early days of Turning Point USA were modest. Folding tables, stacks of flyers, and hand-lettered signs became their tools. Kirk stood in quads across the Midwest, holding slogans like "Big Government Sucks" and "Socialism Sucks." The message was blunt, accessible, and designed to provoke. Students mocked him, argued with him, or simply walked by, but cameras recorded the encounters, and those clips began to circulate online. What began as grassroots agitation quickly grew into a national network. By 2016, Turning Point had chapters on hundreds of campuses. By 2019, the group claimed over 1,000 chapters and a budget of millions, bolstered by wealthy conservative donors who saw Kirk as the youthful counterweight to liberal student activists. Kirk's rise was meteoric. He cultivated close ties with Donald Trump Jr., appeared at rallies, and gained a platform at the Republican National Convention by the time he was only 22. He was not a lawmaker, not a scholar, and not even a college graduate. Yet he wielded influence that rivaled seasoned political operatives. He launched initiatives like Turning Point Action, focused on mobilizing young conservatives for elections, and Turning Point Faith, which tied his message explicitly to Christianity. To his supporters, he was a visionary, a soldier in the cultural war who spoke truths others were too afraid to say. To his critics, he was a provocateur, a demagogue who trafficked in misinformation and division. The controversies piled up quickly. One of Turning Point's most infamous projects was the Professor Watch List, a website cataloging academics accused of liberal bias. Kirk defended it as transparency, a way to hold educators accountable. Critics compared it to McCarthy-era blacklists, warning it endangered careers and stifled dissent. The criticism did not slow him down. If anything, it fueled him. Each outrage added to his notoriety. Each backlash increased his following. He understood the economy of attention better than most. Confrontation was currency. Over time, his rhetoric grew sharper. He dismissed climate change as a socialist hoax designed to control economies. He argued that efforts to combat systemic racism were nothing more than cultural Marxism. He mocked public health measures during the COVID-19 pandemic, accusing authorities of exploiting fear. He amplified conspiracy theories about vaccines, election fraud, and the deep state. His podcast, The Charlie Kirk Show, surged in downloads, ranking among the most popular conservative programs in the nation. His speaking events drew thousands. His Twitter account attracted millions of followers, and each post was crafted to inflame debate. Among his most infamous statements was one delivered at a Turning Point faith event in 2023, when he declared that it was worth having some gun deaths every single year, if that meant protecting the Second Amendment. The line was both chilling and clarifying. To survivors of mass shootings, it was an insult. To his base, it was the plain truth no one else would say out loud. Kirk had found his formula: stake out the most hardline position, couch it in religious or constitutional terms, and let the outrage propel the message further. The more people hated him, the bigger his platform grew. His personal life, however, seemed to follow a quieter rhythm. In 2021, he married Erica Fransve, a former Miss Arizona entrepreneur and Christian podcaster. Their relationship became part of his public brand, the image of a young conservative family building a future together. They had 2 children, who occasionally appeared in photos at events or in carefully curated posts. Kirk urged his audience to marry early, have children, and reject what he described as the nihilism of modern culture. To him, family was not just personal, it was political, a bulwark against liberalism. The Kirk household became a symbol of his message, a blend of Christianity, patriotism, and cultural defiance. But not everything about his public image was controlled. His debates often veered into chaos. At Politicon, he clashed with liberal commentators like Hassan Piker and Kyle Kulinski, exchanges that went viral as shouting matches. At universities like Berkeley, Oxford, and Cambridge, protests erupted whenever he arrived. Students accused him of spreading hate, while his supporters accused the universities of silencing free speech. The spectacle made him both hero and villain, and always ensured he remained in the headlines. By 2024, Kirk was no longer just a campus activist, he was a major force in the conservative movement. His name circulated alongside those of elected officials. He spoke openly about shaping the Republican Party's future, insisting that Christianity must remain at its core. He promoted replacement theory, claiming that immigration policies were designed to dilute the political power of native-born Americans. He called abortion murder and opposed exceptions, even for rape and incest, a position that shocked moderates but thrilled hardline conservatives. Every stance pushed him deeper into the culture war, and every pushback only seemed to entrench his following further. Then came 2025. America was exhausted, fractured, and more divided than ever. The election cycle was heating up, and Turning Point was investing heavily in rallies, voter drives, and media campaigns. Kirk was everywhere, his podcast releasing multiple episodes a week, his speeches filling mega churches and arenas. But the tensions that fueled his career also drew enemies. Online, threats against him escalated. Extremists on the left and right both described him as dangerous, albeit for opposite reasons. Security at his events grew tighter, but Kirk himself brushed off warnings. He had always thrived in confrontation. He believed that fear was a tool of control, and he refused to be controlled. On September 10, 2025, he appeared at Utah Valley University for yet another campus event. The setup was familiar: a folding table, banners, a small crowd of students gathering to debate issues of guns, gender identity, and religion. His wife Erica was there, smiling from the sidelines. The air was tense but routine, another stop in the endless war of ideas. Kirk leaned forward, answering a pointed question about gun rights, repeating his conviction that the Second Amendment was non-negotiable. Then came the crack of a rifle shot. The sound split the air, chaos erupting as students screamed and scattered. Kirk collapsed, a single bullet tearing through his neck. Blood pooled on the ground as his wife screamed for help. Security rushed him into a car, desperate to get him to a hospital, but the damage was irreversible. Within minutes, Charlie Kirk was dead. He was 31 years old. Police arrested the shooter, a 22-year-old student who had been radicalized online, consumed by a cocktail of political rage and personal grievances. Investigators labeled it an act of political assassination. The governor of Utah declared a state of emergency, condemning the violence as an attack on free speech and democracy itself. News broke across the nation instantly. Vigils appeared in Arizona, Florida, and Washington, D.C. Former President Donald Trump called him a champion of liberty. Liberal commentators who had spent years battling him on air condemned the act, insisting disagreement must never spill into bloodshed. Yet even in death, Kirk remained divisive. His supporters declared him a martyr, a victim of leftist hatred, while his critics cautioned against sanitizing the record of a man whose rhetoric often flirted with extremism. Congress observed a moment of silence that quickly descended into partisan shouting. The very divisions that had defined his life carried forward into his death. Charlie Kirk's story is not simply one of rise and fall. It is the story of America's fractured identity, of how culture wars turned teenagers into activists, activists into celebrities, and celebrities into targets. His life reflected the country's fault lines: faith against secularism, freedom against security, nationalism against globalization. He once said some gun deaths were worth it for the sake of liberty. In the end, his own life was claimed by the very violence he defended. His legacy remains unresolved, suspended between admiration and condemnation, inspiration and warning. For his followers, he will forever be the young warrior who spoke without fear. For his critics, he will remain a cautionary tale of what happens when rhetoric outruns responsibility. But for the country, his story is a reminder that words are never just words. They are weapons, they are shields, and sometimes they are the spark that ignites tragedy. This is surviving America, where freedom comes at a cost, where politics is blood sport, and where those who rise highest in the storms of culture and power often find themselves consumed by them. If you found this story powerful, unsettling, or thought-provoking, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us tell the stories of those who shape America and those broken by it.